Welcome everyone. It's 6:15, so I suggest we start today's evening event. A very warm welcome from my side to today's lecture in the Cornelia Goethe Colloquium. My name is Franziska von Verschür. I'm one of the organizers of this semester's lecture series. Tonight, I have the immense pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Catriona Sandilands. She is a professor of environmental arts and justice in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University in Toronto in Canada, from where I think she's joining us tonight. And we're very happy that this is possible in the online format. Since unfortunately she couldn't make it in person. Before immersing in the interdisciplinary field of the environmental humanities, Kate Sandilands received a PhD in sociology. On the university website, I found a really nice description that she has there of the task that she sees herself having as a teacher, researcher, and writer. And she says it is cultivating a plurality of relations with the more than human world, which we as humans are part of. The goal of this is understanding our situatedness and relatedness in and with multi-species communities. And she does this through a plurality of approaches. For one thing, through a theoretical and philosophical interest in ecofeminism and queer ecologies, as a way to explore the intersectional politics of sex, gender, race, disability, and nature. So this nicely ties in with the discussion we had last session as well. Then she also does this through the engagement with environmental literature, eco-criticism, and eco-cultural studies. She's also interested, as we are going to hear tonight, in critical plant studies, that is the interdisciplinary research on plant-people relations, which make tangible both settler capitalist relations of dispossessions, as well as resistant and transformative relations and practices. Last but not least, Kate also is a creative writer and storyteller, which for her is a place-based and relationally based practice towards environmental justice. And this is, as I understand, also something that we're going to hear a bit about tonight. She has a very long and exciting list of publications, which you can access through her website, katesandilands.ca. And I'm just going to mention a few publications here, which I think are important for her work. One is a foundational work and introduction to the field of queer ecologies, the edited volume Queer Ecologies, Sex, Nature, Politics, Desire, published in 2010 together with Bruce Erickson. And then more recently in 2019, she published a book called Rising Tides, Reflections for Climate Changing Times. And this is a collection of fiction, creative nonfiction, memoir, and poetry concerned with the past, present, and future of climate change, seeking to inspire reflection, understanding, conversation, and action. I haven't read it yet, but it sounds really exciting. And yeah. Currently, she's also working on two more book projects. One is called Dear Jane Rule and engages with the literary and political legacy of LGBTQ+ author Jane Rule. And the other one, which lies at the heart of today's talk as well, is Plantasmagoria, Botanical Encounters in the Anthropocene. This is also one inspirational source of the title of our lecture series, which picked up the term of the Anthropocene. This book project is dedicated to botanical biopolitics and human-plant relations. Kate unfolds their entanglement with political and historical contexts such as colonialism, climate change, and misogyny, and explores plant thinking as a feminist, queer, trans, anti-racist, and decolonizing approach to plant-people relations. Her talk today will give us an insight into this current work and is called Bea's Garden, Restorying the Anthropocene. And with this, I close my introduction to today's speaker, and I'm very excited to hear from her now. We will have a lecture of about 45 minutes and then a space for discussion afterwards. Thank you, Kate, for joining us, and the digital floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. First of all, my great thanks to the organizers of this event and of this seminar series, the Cornelia Goethe Center, and especially to Johanna, Franziska, and Amanda, who have taken very good care of me as we prepared for this event. I'm very excited to be part of the conversation, and I'm very sorry that I am not able to be present, physically present with you in Frankfurt. I'm actually coming to you not from Toronto. I'm coming to you from a small island off the west coast of Canada called Galiano Island, which is just to the west of Vancouver, which means I'm in Pacific time, so it's morning for me. So I say good evening to you. And that island, Galiano, turns out is actually the location of the story that I'm going to share with you in part today. So I will tell you a little bit more about that island when we get to the when we get to that part in the conversation. So my talk today is called Bea's Garden, Restoring the Anthropocene. In a nutshell, this is, just to give the plot away at the beginning, in a nutshell, this is my argument. The idea of the human that undergirds the Anthropocene arises from the false biologized understanding of a white male Western genre of humanity, to use Sylvia Wynter's term, aka man, a genre that overrepresents itself, again in her language, as if it were the natural and obvious definition of the human. This idea of the human, this historically specific idea of the human, is predicated on both the dehumanization of most people and the rendering of plant life and the rest of the non-human world as passive, inert, and extractable. Human is here a violent colonial imposition. Thinkers from various traditions have explored the problems with this human in different ways. Black feminists, indigenous thinkers, queer feminist and plant philosophical writers, among others. But in very general terms, all of them point to the importance of responding to the Anthropocene by remembering, exploring, and/or practicing different genres of humanity. Plant philosophy calls for a practice of humanity that recognizes our continuousness with plants rather than violent opposition to them and their modes of being. Several recent literary works of note explore this theme in terms of the desire to become plant, all emphasizing the violence of man that lies at the heart of plant becoming desire. Gothic literature, such as Nathaniel Hawthorne's iconic story, Rappaccini's Daughter, questioned the firmness of the boundary around the human in the 19th century, considering its porosity as a matter of horror at a time when the modern form of white Western bourgeois extractive man was crystallizing as a categorical species being. And finally, revisiting this story via my research creation project, Bea's Garden, turns this Gothic sensibility into an exploration of how we might give humanness a different future, to use Catherine McKittrick's term, specifically a vegetal, decolonial, queer, and feminist one in and for a climate-altered world. If you're going to take a picture of the slides, this is to take a picture of, it's the summary of the work. And now that you know the direction that we're going, I will get down to it properly. The talk will consist of 4 parts. I had originally hoped to read the whole story of Bea's Garden, but it turned out to be quite a bit longer than expected. Perhaps not surprising, given that it responded to quite an elaborate and lengthy Gothic fiction. but it seems more, it's rather than read the whole work, it seems more useful to talk about the logic behind it and to give you glimpses of its narrative style and approach. So I'm going to start out by giving you a little taste of the story Bee's Garden, and then I'm going to walk through at a much slower pace the argument that I want to make about the need for a vegetalizing or vegetal praxis of the human as a way of rethinking Anthropocenic relations. At that point, I want to talk a little bit more about genre, and specifically about plant Gothic and eco-Gothic as a way, as a historical literary mode that has responded to the blurry boundaries of the human in a particular way. I'll also talk a little bit about the story Rappaccini's Daughter, on which Bee's Garden is based. And then I will give you a little bit of the ending of the story, and then we will be able to move on. And I hope I'll be able to respond to any questions if all of that isn't clear at the end of my lecture. So we'll start with about the first 2 pages of the story, Bee's Garden. Bee had been picking stinging nettles. Sitting at her cluttered kitchen table, Eliza had finally persuaded Bee to close her eyes and try to remember the first time she'd felt she was being watched. What came to Bee was the familiar feeling of her thumb and forefingers pinching off the top bracts of the nettle plants that grew in the forest just outside Bee's fenced garden. Bee had been enjoying the March sun through the still healthy Douglas fir trees and thinking how much she loved the feeling of the changing seasons, even though the seasons were now so much more unpredictable. She'd been thinking about the nettle soup she'd make using Eliza's old recipe, how she could use the lemons she'd carefully preserved from her community share, but how she'd have to switch out the chickpeas for cowpeas, because the droughts had made chickpeas almost impossible to source. She'd felt happy that her soup would contribute to the large seasoning awakening tuk-tuk celebration that weekend, hosted by the Spinellicut, that's the local First Nation, owners of the island, but also including settlers like Eliza and Bee, who'd proven themselves good stewards and traders over the years. And Bee had landed on a sudden memory from her childhood. 20 years ago, before the island's treaties were signed in 2041, the event was called Nettlefest. Eliza prodded Bee back from her reminiscence. You were in the nettle patch, and what happened next? Bee opened her eyes and looked at Eliza across the table. Worry made Eliza look much older than her 60-odd years, and she hadn't touched the lavender nettle tea, even though she insisted on making it. Bee sipped hers and thought about it for a minute. I remember I was just picking in my nettle zone, you know, and then there was this wave of cold energy across the back of my neck, like someone was there behind me. I turned around and thought I saw a flicker of movement through the trees, but I figured it was just a deer, so I went back to picking. It was a pretty good nettle soup, I have to say. Those hybridized cowpeas of Jacob's came to the rescue yet again. I wish he'd had time to finish his experiment. Bee couldn't help noticing Eliza's sideways snort at the mention of Bee's father. Bee still found it hard to get through a conversation without mentioning him, even though he'd been dead 10 years, but she understood the older woman's intolerance. After her mother left, Maeve, Eliza and Jacob's long neighborly relationship had withered to 1 part affection, 9 parts truce. Bee took another sip of her tea and returned to her story. I think the next time was about 2 weeks after that, when I was out planting some okra seedlings. I know it was a risk to put them in the garden so early, but we've had such hot Aprils these past few years. I thought I'd give it a try, and you know, they've done pretty well. I'm starting to get fruit already, and it's only the end of May. Anyway, I was down in the okra bed, bent over to whisper some good words to the little plants, and there it was again, that sudden chill, like when someone is standing in front of the sun, only more intense. So you see that opening sets the scene. The story is set in 2060. It's set on Galiano Island, on a small island off the west coast of Canada, which is already experiencing quite extreme, increasing drought conditions. And I'm imagining by 2060 will be an even drier landscape than it is currently. The story aims to be a white settler's response to a decolonized future. So this is a slightly hopeful moment. In the story, the island has been returned to the Spinellicate or Penellicate First Nation, who are the ancestral owners and caretakers of the island. And the nation has allowed a certain number of settlers to remain, settlers who are willing to conform to the long list of rules that they've established around land ownership and community. What else do I need to say about the story? Oh, there's very clearly a Gothic sensibility in the story. There's meant to be an uncanny relationship between Bee and the plants in her garden. And very specifically, as you can tell with the opening line, stinging nettles are going to play a very large role in the plot. So there's a taste of Bee's garden, which is the result of this project. And I will return to the story at the end after I give you a little bit of background about how the project came to be. The term Anthropocene is one that I have chosen quite carefully. And it is based on, it begins with the idea, of course, that in the Anthropocene, humans as such are named as a geological force. What I want to argue, based on the scholarship of Black feminist scholar Sylvia Wynter, specifically in her absolutely extraordinary article, Unsettling the Coloniality of Being, that this idea of the anthropos behind the Anthropocene, this human, is in fact a continuation of what is in fact a local culture of the human, Western bourgeois man, or Homo economicus, that overrepresents itself as if it were the human itself. So what Wynter does is call attention to the fact that our understanding of the human, including, and she does speak to it, she doesn't speak to the Anthropocene specifically, but the idea of the human as Homo economicus, which is the human that is at the center of the Anthropocene, that human is not in fact the sum total of the collection of people who are humans or who are practicing humanity, but it represents itself as a universality, as a singularity in which others who do not approximate that idea appear as less than human. As Catherine McKittrick argues, Wynter's path-breaking work to explore the implication of the bourgeois human, indeed, is founded on. Sorry, that this bourgeois human is both justifies and founded on slavery and colonization. And reveals not only the Eurocentric foundations of the anthropos in the Anthropocene, but the need to rethink the whole question of what it means to be human and how humanity can be better understood as a matter of diverse practice, and how we might give humanness a different kind of future. So my use of the term Anthropocene is meant to highlight this complex set of dynamics. The idea of humans as a geological force is an extension of this idea of the human as a biologized singularity, and needs to be replaced with a thoughtful process of thinking about what it means to be human in diverse relationships to that man, and more importantly, how we might give this humanness a different future. I see this work as intersecting productively with recent work in the field of critical plant studies, and perhaps especially with plant philosopher Michael Marder's extensive reflections on the ways in which plants have been or not been part of the history of Western philosophy that has eventually given rise to this understanding of the human as a singularity and as primarily as an overrepresentation of white bourgeois Western masculinity. As he writes, becoming a human has been thought of as self-fashioning in opposition to the forces of nature, the raging elements, the tyranny of needs for nourishment and shelter, the threat posed by predators, etc. So the idea is that becoming a human is a process of increasing separation from the natural world. And of course, since plants are the foremost representatives of the natural world, our becoming human has been connected to the inversion of their vegetal growth. So we literally, in order to become human, Marder argues, we literally need to grow away from the elements of ourselves that are shared with plants, or for the vegetal elements of our own lives and bodies. And he argues that instead of growing against the vegetal world, which is a synecdoche of nature, becoming human in the context of earthly existence means we should grow with plants and all other living beings rather than against them. We need instead, in other words, to become human in a way that responds with respect to the becomings of plants, not least because our becomings are entirely co-implicated. This, he argues, in conversation with feminist philosopher Luce Irigaray, means that we need to risk intimacy with the vegetal world. And the theme of intimacy runs through the dialogue that he and Irigaray have in their marvelous book, Through Vegetal Being, Two Philosophical Perspectives, which was published in 2016 and takes the form of a dialogue. Running through the dialogue with Irigaray and Through Vegetal Being is the sense of opening to the vegetal other, and it includes an idea of a reconstituted selfhood that enriches kinship with the vegetal world. Coexistence with vegetal being, in Irigaray's quote, slips into her own vegetal existence, suggesting that encounters with the vegetal other, intimate encounters with the vegetal other, openness to the possibility of growing with the vegetal other, helps reveal elements of one's own vegetal existence. In other words, takes the form of a more vegetal or vegetally oriented genre of humanity. This idea of becoming plant as a response to the Anthropocene, or as a recognition of buried undercurrents in Western philosophy, is taken up in a variety of ways. I won't go into an enormous amount of detail, but there are a couple of different versions of this. So in the quote on the left that we see from philosopher Karen Houle, she takes up a Deleuzian approach that considers becoming plant as an idea of entering into composition with something else in a way that the physical particles emitted from the aggregate, thus composed, will verb vegetally. So becoming plant is the emission of particles from an alliance that we make with plants, in order to express action in relation to the unique qualities of plants or plant lives. So we are always, in other words, in our interactions with plants in the process of becoming plant. Again, I think I slightly favor Michael Marder, not least because in this passage from his article "Resist Like a Plant," which was written in response to the Occupy movement in the early 2010s, he specifically argues that if we're going to move away from what I will call in a minute anti-extractive relationships with plants, that it behooves us to actually consider that we need to learn something from them and to follow them in a model of a more vegetal humanity, allowing something of plant nature to flourish inside our own human nature. So here I want to return our attention. So on the one hand, we have critical plant studies, which argues, particularly in the works of plant philosophers such as Marder, that we need to consider that there are vegetal elements of the self that have been present all along, and that even if they may have been overlooked in the context of Western philosophy and history, and that we need to consider how a more vegetal practice of intimacy with plants, a more vegetal practice of the self, might bring to light these vegetal qualities of human existence. But I want to return very specifically to the idea of the Anthropocene, and specifically to the violences that inhere in the idea of the Anthropocene. And here I think of the work of geographer Catherine Youssef, in whose book, A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, she points out that the human and its subcategory, the inhuman, are historically relational to a discourse of settler colonial rights and the mixed material practices of extraction. So Youssef argues that the rendering of human as singularity is founded on an extractive mode of being. And that extractive mode of being requires the understanding of matter, including plants, as passive and in need of activation by the human, i.e. by Western bourgeois man, in order to develop the idea of social good. And she also argues, as does Winter, that this idea of the human is absolutely inextricable from relations of colonialism and slavery. Here, the non-human turn, so the idea in which, sort of the general current in which critical plant studies is located, in which we might look to the non-human we look at the non-human as a place of liveliness and agency rather than just passive matter. That non-human turn requires not only a rethinking of the activity of matter, but also attention to the dynamics of dehumanization in terms of whose agency is the model from which all others are understood as departures. So here, alongside critical plant studies, I would argue that an attention to a vegetal mode of humanity needs to pay attention to not just to the ways in which plants are excluded, but to the ways in which most human beings are also excluded through relations of forced settlement and transatlantic slavery, and also through the very specifically extractive process of constituting matter as passive. Now, this might sound like extraordinarily abstract concern, and I want to return it to return these very complex abstract questions to what I see as an emerging cultural phenomenon, which is the appearance of a number of highly regarded and quite popular literary texts that play with the idea of becoming plant in the Anthropocene. There are many examples, and I'm going to talk about two of them. One of them is a work called "How I Became a Tree," which was written by Indian author Sumana Roy and published in 2017, and it has become a very unlikely bestseller. It's a memoir of a woman who wants to become a plant, who wants to become a tree, quite specifically. And the book is a really interesting meandering through largely Indian story traditions and also scientific traditions to uncover the places and relations in which the boundary between the human and the tree has been breached. What's particularly interesting about Roy is that she begins this sort of voyage to discover the possibility of a life in, with, and as a tree, is that her primary motivation for doing so has to do with what she calls the specter of violence. She wanted to become a tree because she loved the way in which trees coped with dark and lonely places while sunlessness decided curfew hours for me. So she saw in tree modes of being and temporality a possibility of existence that, as a woman, she felt that she was, well, she didn't feel that she was denied as a female person living in a sexist and violent society. When she dug a little bit, and I think this is actually a very interesting observation, when she dug a little bit into the literary and cultural histories of women becoming trees, of course, she landed on a number of Indian stories, but she also, of course, landed on the story of Apollo and Daphne, who in the Greek mythology, and particularly in the version that was related by Ovid in Metamorphoses, Daphne was turned into a tree, a laurel tree specifically, precisely so that she could escape being raped by Apollo. And as she dug, she discovered that there was no culture whose folklore did not have at least one tale where a girl, harassed, killed, or volitionally, had not turned into a tree. So she recognizes in How I Became a Tree that her desire to become a tree actually is one moment in a very long tradition of women becoming trees as a response to, or indeed as an odd form of protection from, male violence. The second example, and again there are several. The second example is possibly a more disturbing one, and that is the novel that won the 2016 International Booker Prize, The Vegetarian, by South Korean author Han Kang. And in The Vegetarian, the protagonist Young Hye first decides that she is going to become a vegetarian. Very directly in response to the carno-phallogocentric violences that she sees going on around her, the equation of meat eating with masculinity and violent masculinity. And over the course of the story, she decides that she is going to stop eating because she actually finds greater sensory and erotic pleasure in the prospect of being a tree herself. So she doesn't need to eat, she wants to eat light. And she eventually ends up in a mental hospital committed there after well, she ends up in a mental hospital. The last part of the book is narrated by her sister, and her sister watches her slowly slowly imagine herself transforming into a tree, while she simultaneously starves herself and renounces her own human form. So because it's not a work of magic realism, Yonghe is not able to turn into a tree, and the idea of, and her taking on of the form of a tree is actually a perpetuation of a certain kind of violence. On the other hand, we actually see in a number of very vivid passages the extraordinary pleasure and enrichment that she gets from her own vegetal desire. So the book actually, again, it won the 2016 Booker, International Booker. So there were a lot of people talking about women becoming trees at that point. It really shows the extraordinary destructiveness of the model of humanity that Yonghe feels that she has to reject entirely in order to take on the possibility of becoming tree. So in a nutshell, my argument, the context for the larger project is that vegetal connection is violently disavowed in the process of producing the Western bourgeois ideal of man. These violences include the rendering of plants and the rest of the world deemed inhuman as extractable passive material, a rendering of the world that is absolutely tied and predicated on the quantitative rendering of some people, Black, Indigenous, queer, female, as less than human. Plant becoming in this context is not a rejection of humanity, but rather a form of aspiration to a different genre of humanity, one that cultivates something of the plant that flourishes in us. So argues in conversation with, for example, Hong Kong, that it is possible one doesn't have to reject as per this quote, she doesn't want to stop living, she wants to stop living like us. That it is actually possible to reject that overgeneralized genre of humanity and practice a new version that involves cultivating something of the plant that flourishes in us, in Marder's terms. This aspiration toward a vegetal plant becoming results from and refuses structural violences that are predicated on and legitimated by the falsely universal understanding of man that is the central figure of the Anthropocene, i.e. the idea of vegetal becoming, or at least feminist vegetal becoming, responds to colonization, not just the desire for plantiness. Queer and feminist decolonizing explorations of plant becoming offer a way of restoring the Anthropocene to bring into view other genres of humanity that are both already lived and can flourish in the future in new ways. These plant becomings involve actively desiring and incorporating vegetal forms of temporality, connection, pleasure, and responsibility that draw energy into alternate webs of eroticism, kinship, and ecological solidarity. And I note as a final thought before we move on into Rappaccini's daughter, that many Indigenous traditions already include relational philosophies of human and non-human personhood, including plant personhood, and including understandings of kinship and ecological relationship and pleasure that involve relations of reciprocity and obligation and respect between human and plant persons. I do not wish to appropriate those understandings. Rather, I seek to cultivate an imaginative approach that seeks allyship with, rather than appropriation of these traditions, which is the thought that I'd like you to hold on to as we move into the next section. So here I'd like to introduce the idea of the Gothic, and specifically the eco-Gothic. So the Gothic is a literary genre or set of literary genres that involve a very particular kind of aesthetic. If you think of the cliched line, it was a dark and stormy night, you have the Gothic. You have an introduction to the Gothic. These are stories that generally play around with ideas of horror, and particularly ideas of horror that circulate around the fragility of the human body, and the fragility of the fragility of the idea of human mastery that goes along with the idea of the rational individual bourgeois individuated human body. So right away, I would say that the Gothic is a literary tradition that haunts that haunts the idea of the Anthropocene, and that haunts the idea of Western bourgeois man. It's a literary tradition that arose in the 19th century in a variety of places, in Italy, in Germany, and in the United States and in the UK. It arose around the Industrial Revolution, sort of starting in the mid 19th century, as a way of reflecting on the massive changes to human society that were going on at the time, including science. So you just think about the story behind Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, which is also an example of the Gothic. So exploring the hubris behind scientific experimentation, the ways in which the boundary between nature and culture was seen to be ruptured through technological progress and also dramatic social change. So the Gothic, in other words, emerged from and explored and reflected on a period of history in the 19th century in which concepts of human and non-human identity were radically destabilized. The Gothic, as writes David Del Principe, often portrays this estrangement in panicked dystopian terms. Indeed, the Gothic is wont to remind us that we are shaped not only by where we come from, but by what we eat and how we interact with the environment and all forms of life. The eco-Gothic, so looking at Gothic literature through an eco-critical or environmental lens, ties the Gothic body, so the unhuman, non-human, transhuman, post-human, or hybrid, thinks of the Gothic body not just in panicked dystopian terms, but inquires into the ways in which these stories, set in their historical contexts, can be read as places in which, through which we can develop a more meaningful understanding of the unhuman, the uncanny, the non-human, as a site of articulation for a more environmental and species identity. Plants have a particular role to play in this idea of eco-horror, and in fact, plants are and fungus are regular participants in the Gothic tradition. They are involved with creepiness. They transcend sort of appropriate plant boundaries by being carnivorous plants. Of course, there are carnivorous plants, which is part of the sort of the fascination, the scientific fascination with carnivorous plants found itself translated into Gothic fictions of the 19th century. And both plants and fungi are associated with soil and dirt and decomposition and death, all of which are very strongly Gothic tropes. Marder notes that the idea that the continuation of life that has been that he would argue that Gothic the emergence of plants in Gothic literature represents a trace of a traumatic encounter, so a kind of life that has been shaken up by rupture. And as he writes, we cannot help but feel a tinge of the uncanny in these questions, demanding that we discern the constitutive vegetative otherness in ourselves when we are confronted by the vegetal other in Gothic literature. Dawn Keatley, in her introduction to the book Plant Horror, argues much more directly that plant horror has long recognized the non-human in the human and has perennially explored in exaggerated fictional modes the attenuating of those things we think of as human as they succumb to the imminent vestiges of the vegetal. So there is a large, there's quite a tradition of plant horror that was, it came into being, particularly in the 19th century, in response to the Industrial Revolution, in response to the emergence of evolutionary theory that, and Darwin in particular, that called into question the idea of human supremacy, in response to the proliferation of exotic plants that was going on at the time. So the role of colonial botany in proliferating the idea of plant monstrosity around the world, including but not only carnivorous plants. So it emerged in the 19th century. And as Principe and others have argued, the Gothic sensibility is also re-emerging with a vengeance in the 21st century as we respond to the Anthropocene, to environmental crisis, and specifically to climate change. Another place where we can see enormous social transformation as accompanied by a questioning of what it means to be human in this situation. So the particular story that Bee's Garden is based on, and I won't go into an enormous amount of detail, I encourage you to read the story, which is easily available online. The particular story that that I chose to work with in my own research creation project is Nathaniel Hawthorne's really quite magnificently Gothic short story, Rappaccini's Daughter, which was written in 1844. And Rappaccini's Daughter is really interesting for a whole number of reasons. It's quite a long story as far as short stories go, and it is full of, it really sets in motion just about every Gothic trope that you can imagine. There is an enclosed space. There are plants. There are exotic plants. There is a sense of complicated cross-species boundary crossing sexuality. So it's really quite a magnificent story for thinking about questions of plant horror. I'd like to particularly point out that the story centrally involves, like Frankenstein, a critique of the role of experimental science in disrupting the idea of the natural order. specifically Rappaccini's daughter, I think quite interestingly, given that it was written by a white male American in the 19th century, really does demonstrate some disillusionment with the model of masculine humanity that places women and plants together as extractable material. Giovanni, who is a young scientist, comes to Padua, which was the location of what some people consider the very first European botanical garden. He comes to Padua. He actually comes to study he comes to study at the university. And is given lodgings in a place that overlooks this specific walled garden, and the garden is owned by an experimental botanist, Giacomo Rappaccini. Over the course of the story, the struggle is, although it is over Beatrice, who is figured as part plant herself, but the struggle is really among the scientists, none of whom come out too well in the end. So there is a real questioning of the, particularly because Beatrice dies at the end of the story after drinking a medicine that is supposed to cure her, i.e. the product of science. So that there's a real skepticism in this story in a really interesting way about the way in which scientific experimentation buttresses a particular white masculine understanding of rational humanity. There's also, of course, the theme of the garden and the role of colonial botany in cementing the extractive Western bourgeois man as the active subject, achieving mastery over nature. So the botanical garden is a historically important site for this kind of cultivation of the exotic of the world as a site of exotic commodities for scientific for the generation of scientific knowledge, and a clear, and the story is a clear hearkening back to Yusuf. The story is a very clear demonstration of the idea that the white male scientist animates the passive female, even if erotically charged nature. So the meaning of the garden, the meaning of the plants, is to forward mastery, not to, for example, dwell in the realm of pleasure itself. Finally, I want to point to the uncanniness of Beatrice's relationships with the exotic plants that she tends in her father Rappaccini's garden. And these are two direct quotes from the story. She bent toward the magnificent plant, which I believe looks something like the one in the picture, and opened her arms as if to embrace it. Yes, my sister, my splendor, it shall be Beatrice's ask to nurse and serve thee, and thou shalt reward her with thy kisses and perfume breath, which to her is the breath of life. Giovanni at his lofty window rubbed his eyes and almost doubted whether it were a girl tending her favorite flower or one sister performing the duties of affection to another. So there is very clearly here a relationship of woman becoming plant, and at the end of the day, although Beatrice is actually quite happy with her beloved plants, her beloved sister plants in the garden, until Giovanni comes along. But because she and the plants are toxic to the version of masculinity and to the masculine bodies who would like to achieve mastery over them, when they try to cure her, of course, she dies at the end of the story. I'm going to skip this slide because I see that I am already over time, but I want to I want to underline the fact that, well, I want to underline the fact that it's actually hard not to read Hawthorne's intent as rather queer. This is a very erotically charged female plant sexual ecological space. I think it's very interesting that sort of at this 19th century moment, he sees this kind of vegetal version of sort of ecofeminist humanity as incompatible with Western scientific progress made in the name of bourgeois man. So in an odd way, I actually agree with Mr. Hawthorne. And that is why I decided that I would take this story from its 19th century Gothic origins and put it in the 21st century. I think I'm actually going to stop. I'm quite considerably over time. If you would like me to tell you a little bit more about how that process found itself into the actual Story Bee's garden, I can give you a little bit of a plot summary and sort of give you another reading perhaps at the end. But I want to make absolutely sure that there's time for questions. And perhaps it would be good to sort of have a conversation about some of these ideas, and then perhaps I could conclude with a little bit from the story.
Thank you so much, Kate, for your talk and for this discussion. And there are many open threads to be continued, many more questions that we can't discuss today. But it was really a pleasure to have you and to have this opportunity to think together about plant becoming. I'm afraid we will have to close today's session. Thank you everyone for coming. And the next lecture in the lecture series is already coming up next week, so I don't want to forget mentioning that. Alyssa Battistoni is going to talk about the labor of life, theorizing labor with and against nature. So we look forward to having another interesting speaker with us. And for today, thanks everyone and have a nice rest of the evening.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much.